Hello, everybody, and welcome to an article breakdown where we are going to be going through a very important concept in Magic the Gathering on how to stop playing scared, or as the author of the article, Reid Duke, puts it, how to smell blood and level up your game. Now, Reid Duke is, of course, in the Magic the Gathering Hall of Fame. He's a Pro Tour champion. He is a runner-up world champion, so he's a great player. He explains this concept really well, but because this is kind of an old article, I'm going to be going through it so newer audiences can understand this concept, learn from it, and then I'll be explaining the examples to make things even easier to follow. Let's dive in. How to Smell Blood and Level Up Your Game. Stop Playing Scared by Reid Duke. They basically are releasing these articles, but still quite nice. It's a fairly intuitive concept that when you're losing, you may need to take some chances and make big plays in order to come back. Just in case this isn't intuitive to you, basically, if you're going to lose anyway, you might as well take a couple shots and maybe Hail Mary your way back into the game. If you've ever played a sport, there's often like Hail Marys in football or things like that, where if you're behind, you do some crazy stuff. So just to make sure it's intuitive for everyone. Similarly, when you're ahead, you have more flexibility to choose a safe line and make sure nothing goes wrong. What's most difficult is the middle ground, where the game is close, or if you're ahead by a thin margin and you have access to a risky play where the outcome is uncertain. Imagine your opponent has a creature of moderate value, like a Goblin Shaman token from Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and that means that it's going to make a 2/2 red Goblin Shaman with whenever it attacks, create a treasure token. So a reasonable creature. If you have your way, your opponent won't be untapping with that token. You can answer it directly with a Braid, which is a 2-mana deal 3, so you can kill the creature, or you can try to kill it in a much more profitable way by casting a Glorybringer. So Glorybringer is this big dragon. When you attack with it, you can exert it, which means it won't untap during your next untap step, and deal 4 damage to a creature that is a non-dragon. So basically, you can use your creature to remove it, which is like recurring value, or you can use a removal spell to kill it. So the Glorybringer is a much better play if it works out. Okay. The only catch is your opponent has open mana and cards in hand, and therefore might be able to kill the Glorybringer, which would result in a major tempo setback. What should you do? So the reason it's a tempo setback is because if you play your Glorybringer and then before combat they kill it, you don't get to kill the Goblin token because you won't get to attack with your Glorybringer and exert it. So that's kind of it. You can either kill the creature for sure with your Braid, or you can use your Glorybringer, and if they kill your Glorybringer, you're behind, or you are way ahead if it works. There's a type of player who will always make the optimistic play of casting Glorybringer. This type of player tends to cast their spells in the obvious way and loves that visceral feeling of making a blowout play. There's another type of player, even more common among strong tournament competitors, who will never risk the Glorybringer dying and will instead always play it safe. Today, I'll improve your game by teaching you to have both playstyles in your repertoire and to know how to choose between them based on the circumstances. Some history. For many years, I was the second type of player. Reid Duke, of course, being him saying I was the second. Yeah. I lived by the mantra of always plan for the worst. I valued consistency and protecting myself from blowouts above everything else. I would always give my opponent credit for having it, and I would play around everything. It wasn't entirely coincidence that caused me to develop this playstyle. I played Magic for 15 years before I ever qualified for the Pro Tour, and I was a somewhat dedicated PTQ and Magic Online grinder for at least 4 or 5 of those years. He actually won the Magic Online Championship Series. Oh, one of those years, not that he mentions that here. What this means is that most of my experience with Magic, I was noticeably more serious, experienced, and quite often simply better than my opponents. Under these circumstances, it's natural to develop a very safe playstyle. When nothing went wrong, I would usually win. If I played a long, close game, I would make better plays in the long run and come out on top. So as you get better as a Magic player, you naturally are just going to make slightly better decisions over time. So if you play a game where each player makes 50 decisions, you're going to naturally come out ahead. So if you make the conservative play where you just kill their Goblin Shaman token in this case, or the conservative play, use your removal spell, not go for the high upside Hail Mary play, or even just like slightly high upside play, you're going to come out ahead if you just make the consistent play because it'll make the game go longer and there's no like big swings. So that's why as you get better, you tend to develop these safer play styles. At long last, I got to the Pro Tour and I was in for a rude awakening. For one thing, I bricked my first 5 PTs. Bricks means that you went really, really badly. It didn't go well. For another, I went 1-11 in my first 12 draft matches with my first Pro Tour team, the Pantheon. What gives? I was outperforming many of my peers on the Grand Prix and Magic Online Championship Series circuits, but I couldn't buy a win at the highest levels of competition. The problem was that what I had been an effective playstyle for a strong PTQ player was terrible for an average PT player. I was playing towards long, close games, but instead of usually winning them, I was usually losing them. I lacked the ability to score easy wins, and I wasn't pressing the advantages when I had them. I didn't know how to smell blood. I think this is just a way of saying, like, If your opponent is weakened, it makes them easier to defeat or things like that. Versus, if they're on the back foot, if you smell blood, quote unquote, you pounce when they're at their weakest and you take them down. And that's kind of like making the higher upside play a lot of the time. Example, search for Azcanta. So just to explain this card, this is like a really good card in a control mirror. So if you're playing a long, slow match, search for Azcanta is really, really good. Imagine that I'm playing a control mirror against LSV. If you've never heard of LSV, he's another very, very good Magic the Gathering player in the Hall of Fame, Pro Tour champion, all that good stuff. And that we have roughly equal skill in the matchup. In my articles and in my wildest dreams are the only places where this is true. Though maybe now after some more time for him to play, Reid Duke and LSV are a lot closer in power level in terms of just skill level. But for most readers, LSV is going to be significantly better than them as a player. I'm on the draw and on turn, including myself. I'm not trying to put myself into some super group here. But yeah, I'm on the draw and on turn 2, I find myself with a pretty strong hand. I have a good mix of lands and spells, a permission spell, which means a counter spell, and a search for Azcanta. So search for Azcanta is this card that's like 2 mana, it like filters your draw step, and then it flips into a land that can get you extra spells, which is really, really good. Given my strong hand, I know I can develop properly and estimate I have a 55% chance to win if the game does go long. Even if it's even chance on even footing, so the possibility he misses a land drop or otherwise has a poor hand. However, if I stick an early search, so basically this little second clause is saying that like Reid Duke knows that his hand is good, but LSV could have a bad hand. And in that case, Reid Duke having a good hand just in and of itself gives him an edge. However, if I stick an early search for Azcanta, my chances of winning go up quite a lot, say something like 75%. Luis has 2 mana open, and I know his deck has 3 Syncopates, which is a counter spell unless they pay X. So he can cast it for 2 mana and basically counter the search for Azcanta. If I cast the search and he Syncopates, he gets a profitable exchange, and I lose the opportunity to find a safer spot to resolve search later on. Now we're back to 50-50. According to my old playstyle of planning for the worst, I wouldn't cast my search, I would give my opponent credit for having the Syncopate. This play might make sense if you have a deck advantage or if you're a much stronger player, or for whatever reason you feel confident in your ability to win the long game. For example, maybe you have a sideboard card that has gives you a huge edge in the long game. But given an equal opponent and the numbers that I've laid out, it's clear the best play is to cast search for Azcanta. Sure, under the bad case scenario, you get an unfavorable exchange and reduces your chances of winning. However, you give yourself a chance to secure an easy win, which is a precious way of breaking the 50-50 holding pattern of a close matchup against an equal opponent. Now, say I play Luis 1,000 times, and the base result should be each wins 500. Imagine each time I face this situation, I make the conservative play and pass my turn with open mana. Every time Luis faces it, he goes for it. Sometimes I have Syncopate, and sometimes I don't. So in a game where I have Search for Azcanta, this example is a pretty long way of saying that basically if Luis makes the risky play every time, and it doesn't work out sometimes, but it does work out sometimes, the EV for LSV is a lot higher in this case. But we'll finish off the way of saying it. When I have Search for Azcanta, we still play a long, close game where I win half the time, or very slightly more than half the time. In a game where Luis has Search for Azcanta, I either have Syncopate and we play a long, close game, or I don't have Syncopate and he gives himself a great chance for the easy win. The end result is he's going to win more than his fair share of the games. We'll split the ones that go long and are close, but he'll get some freebies on top of that. I started the example by proposing that LSV and myself were equally skilled. We're equally good at strategizing, knowing what's important, and setting up late-game counter wars. But we're not really equal because I'm employing an inferior strategy, and I'm not capitalizing on the games where my deck delivers something special. So in this case, the something special is a turn 2 search for Azcanta. When I first got to the Pro Tour, I was employing exactly this type of inferior strategy and was losing more than half of my games against skilled opponents. So basically, you have to be willing to take more risks if you're playing against good opponents because you're not just going to be able to win every single close game. Smelling blood. I went back to the drawing board and leveled up my game by learning how to smell blood. Smelling blood means pressing an advantage and capitalizing as much as possible on the situations where you're ahead. Just as a wild animal might go after something that's wounded or weakened, you want to recognize when your opponent doesn't have what they need to defend themselves. To do it effectively, you should consider 4 questions. First, what are the chances that my opponent has it? Think probabilistically. What information do you have about the opponent's hand? If they had the card they needed, would they have used it already? If the card in question is a removal spell and you're ahead on the board, the chances are that they don't have it. If they did, they wouldn't have let themselves fall behind. So either your opponent drew it, or they're just being cagey, or you've misjudged the situation. All 3 are certainly possible, but relatively unlikely. Or else they don't have it. So if in terms of thinking probabilistically, it can also be beneficial to know how many copies of that card are in your opponent's deck if you're playing constructed. So in limited, you generally assume they don't have like too many copies that are multiples. But if you're playing constructed and you know your opponent has 4 copies of counterspell, then if they hold up blue, then counterspell should be more on your mind than in the situation where you know they only have 1 counterspell. So that's another way to think probabilistically. Factor in all the information to make the best judgment you can. Second, what happens if you take the risk and it works? Often it means winning the game or gaining an advantage that snowballs out of control. Your opponent might have Counterspell, which is blue to counter target spell, but if you're ahead on board and go for the Armageddon, which is a 4-mana way to destroy all lands, then you're going to win the games where it resolves. Third, what happens if you take the risk and it doesn't work? So your Armageddon gets counterspelled, it's annoying, and you let your opponent use their mana, but it's still a 1-for-1 trade, which means they traded their counterspell for your Armageddon, so 1 card for 1 card, where you stay ahead on the board. In other circumstances, the costs might be higher, like if you go for a lethal attack and your opponent has a trick to help them survive and kill you on the backswing. It's all about risk and reward, and when you're ahead in the game, the risk part should be your biggest concern. The reason he says it like this is if you're ahead in the game and you're going to win as long as things stay in their current holding pattern, there's no need for you to take excessive risks. If you're hitting your opponent with your flyer every turn and they have no defenses that can block a flyer and you have a counterspell to protect your flyer, you can ignore a lot of cards because you're going to win with your flyer. Things like that. If the games are close, you have to maybe take some slightly more risks so that you can gain an advantage. But the further you are ahead, the more you want to focus on cards your opponent could have to get them out of the situation, rather than, okay, I'm just going to make the play that blows my opponent out if it works and kind of puts me behind if it doesn't work. Finally, what happens if you make the conservative play? You decide to wait on the Armageddon. That's fine. Maybe you just win the game a little slower. But maybe your opponent top decks Wrath of God, which is a classic board sweeper that kills all creatures, and erases your board advantage. Now casting Armageddon might not even be profitable, and you have to go back to fighting a close, even game. As I hinted earlier, if you have a sizable skill or matchup advantage, then taking a conservative line will tend to look better. But as the level of competition increases, the more important it becomes to give yourself every chance to spike an advantage. Example, Glorybringer. So we're back to our first example, circling back. With that in mind, let's return to our original example. Your opponent has a Goblin Shaman, and you're choosing whether to kill it with a Braid or whether to try for the much more profitable play of casting and attacking with Glorybringer. First, so we're now going through the 4-step process he outlined. First, how likely is it your opponent has removal? Which removal spells can kill a Glorybringer at instant speed? Let's say they're playing Pioneer Rakdos midrange and have 2 mana open. Fatal Push, so that's a spell that can kill small creatures generally, not a Glorybringer. Molten Collapse, which is a sorcery speed way to kill Glorybringer. And Power Will to Kill won't do it because this one can't kill dragons. So that leaves things like Go for the Throat, which can kill non-artifacts, so it kills Glorybringer. Infernal Grasp, which can kill Glorybringer. And Bitter Triumph, which can also kill Glorybringer. Or whatever functional equivalent happens to be in style. Sure, if you haven't cast a creature all game, it's plausible they could be holding it. But if you've had your own Goblin Shaman running Roughshod all game, then it might stand to reason they're defenseless. What's the risk and reward? The reward seems pretty great, as you get to connect with a giant creature and kill the token effectively for free. They'll still need to draw an answer for the Glorybringer, and you'll be holding a Braid for their next threat. However, the risk is also large, since failing to kill the token means giving the opponent an extra attack and an extra treasure, which could determine the outcome of a close game. If you play it safe, how likely are you to win? Maybe you're ahead on board, or maybe you really like your plan for the matchup. However, what makes me the most nervous is that the conservative line requires spending your Braid, which could leave you vulnerable to the reflection of Kiki Jiki that you know is coming in a couple of turns, because this Fable of the Mirror Breaker will eventually flip into a 2/2 with a powerful ability. So should you cast a Braid or Glorybringer the next time you face the choice? I can't really answer that question because it depends so much on the fine details of the situation. But if you take 2 things away from what you've read today, the first should be the general thought process to use when facing these tough decisions. The second should be the idea that you must be willing to make the Glorybringer play when the situation calls for it. So really, you can't always default to the safe play. You have to be willing to take risks in a game of Magic, and this is true not only when you're behind and mounting a comeback, but also when the game is close, and sometimes when you're ahead. You'll win more in the long run when you're keeping your eyes open for easy wins and opportunities for advantage. And yes, if I'm only worried about Go for the Throat and don't have any specific reason to believe they have it, then I'm gambling on the Glorybringer. So, hopefully you enjoyed this article, this analysis breakdown. It's an article that I recently reread and found it to be very, very helpful, especially when I'm playing myself. So I wanted to share it with all of you. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, remember to hit the like button, subscribe for more videos, and in the comment section down below, leave #glory, because we're all about that Glorybringer life. And glory is half of Glorybringer, I guess. And it's just an easy way to let me know you made it to the end of the video and enjoyed this type of video. So #glory in the comment section down below, as well as any questions or feedback or article suggestions you'd like me to break down in the future. That's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.